Hello everyone, I'm J.P. Jones and I'm the Don Bennett Moon Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for the third installment of our 8th annual Downtown Lecture Series. This year's topic is Woman Power, and of course we're holding it completely virtually. In the previous 2 Thursdays, you've heard fabulous talks by our distinguished women faculty on the power of imagination as expressed in fairy tales and the power to contest skepticism over gender-based violence. Tonight, as we get close to the election, we have a very important speaker on the topic of women in politics, Latino women in politics, and in particular on their stories, both inspiring and frustrating as they attempt to assert their political voice. Before I go further, I want to recognize this place, Pinka Restaurante on East Broadway in downtown Tucson. Pinka is a culinary brainchild of Patricia Schwabe. This stylish restaurant is a fusion of traditional, modern, and even esoteric culinary delights from central Mexico. And it has a fabulous small batch mezcal bar. SBS has hosted many gatherings here at Pinka, and Patricia and her husband Ron have been big supporters of our Downtown Lecture Series over the past 8 years. We long for the day when we can come back and be together here at Pinka and all the other establishments around downtown Tucson that make our city such a diverse and lively place to live. And now I want to thank our sponsors for this Downtown Lecture Series. The first, our major sponsors, Mike and Beth Kasser and Holualoa Companies. Thank you, Mike and Beth, for your confidence and your support of our community engagement activities. And thank you also for all you do for the arts in Tucson. And I'd also like to recognize the financial support of my good friends Ken and Linda Robin and our friends up in Saddlebrook, Dr. Barbara Starrett and Joanne Ellison. Thank you all for your support. And now to Dr. Lisa Sanchez. Her topic on women power is Power Wielded. And it comes with a provocative subtitle, Latinas on the Quiet Power of Sacrifice. Lisa received her PhD in political science from the University of New Mexico. She joined SBS's School of Government and Public Policy as an assistant professor in 2016. In a few short years, she has become the university's go-to person for both local and national media interested in analysis on Latino politics in Arizona. On the research front, she's published extensively on racial and ethnic divisions in American politics, on such topics as immigration policy, LGBTQ political participation, social media influence, campaign financing, and the polarization of politics in the United States, among a lot of other topics. Right now, she's working on a book on Latino Republicans. I'm sure you're going to enjoy tonight's lecture. So without further ado, Dr. Lisa Sanchez.
Thank you, JP, for your kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the SBS Downtown Lecture Series team for making this possible. I'm so pleased to be here with you to share my work on Latino politics, specifically the power wielded by Latinas in the United States. Before we begin, a quick word on nomenclature. Though I recognize the differences between the terms Latino and Hispanic, I will use them all interchangeably throughout this lecture. Their usage has become similar enough in the last several decades as to give me kind of leave to do so. When I was approached about this lecture, I was very excited. The topic of Latinas, politics, and power was right in my wheelhouse. As a Hispanic woman myself, what I will share with you today calls to mind not only my own identity, but the identities of my mother, my sisters, my cousins, my aunts, and my 2 little girls. I'll admit that as I prepared this lecture, I experienced increased anxiety about the topic. I began to struggle because there was so much I wanted to share in such a short period of time. 45 minutes, How was I going to do it? What would I keep? What would I cut? What did I want to leave you with at the end of this talk? Finally, inspiration struck, as it's apt to do, in the unlikeliest of places, the wisdom of a 3-year-old. Or perhaps not so unlikely if you know my 3-year-old Maria. One night before bed, as I was putting her in her pajamas, my daughter looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Mom, I want to be the tiny kitty." Frazzled after a long day of work and house chores, I said, "Okay." But she said it again, and she continued to repeat it until I finally said with as much conviction as I could muster, "Okay, you're my tiny kitty." Adorable grammatical errors aside, she was demonstrating to me in a very simple way the common problem of marginalized groups. The ability to feel powerful enough to engage in acts of self-determination without ascription and permission from the mainstream. In simpler terms, she didn't feel that her declaration of her identity as a tiny kitty was realized until Mom ascribed it to her. Much the same process has occurred among Latinos in the last 50 years. Indeed, until 1970, the United States federal government counted individuals of Spanish-speaking origin as white. If you know a little bit about being Latino pre-1970, you'll understand that they were treated anything but white. Many of my students are often surprised to find out about the acts of discrimination and overt racism directed towards Latinos in the United States. As far back as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Latinos have lacked the protections of non-Latino whites when it came to everything from land rights, to voting, to educational opportunities, to rights of the accused. In fact, LULAC, the oldest and largest U.S. Latino interest group, was founded due to the rampant hangings of Mexican Americans in Texas and an incident where a Mexican American child choked to death because she was not allowed to use a whites-only water fountain. Interestingly, LULAC was one of the first national organizations to recognize a role for Latino women through their creation of LULAC's women's councils. What is perhaps most interesting, though, is during the time of high discrimination, the Latino identity was invisible. Their poverty and discrimination was not actually officially recognized nor tracked until 1970, when the U.S. Census placed this question on the 1970 census. It was an important step in the social construction of the term Latino. It read, "Is this person's origin or descent Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American, other Spanish, or no, none of these?" The placement of this question on the census empowered and enshrined the Latino identity. This is not to say that the census flipped a switch and the identity was created, but the original organic social construction of what we understand today to be Latino or Hispanic was finally given formal recognition by the United States government. In so doing, the Latino community had more power in numbers, the power of knowledge. We can now track how many Latinos there were in the United States, their socioeconomic status, their needs, and their relationship with government. So much like my 3-year-old's identity as a kitty, the Latino identity wasn't given its full weight until the census finally recognized it. Today, the Hispanic origin question reads, Hispanic or Latino refers to a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. Regardless of race, in this line, the census firmly draws a line between the concept of race and the concept of ethnicity. Scholars, too, recognize differences between the two. Here you see the common definitions provided by researchers in this area. Race can be defined as a group of individuals sharing phenotypical attributes, physical features, shared culture, and a group-based historical memory. To be considered a racial category in the United States, your identity is often socially imposed or ascribed to you based on the way you look. Race is often associated with biology, and it is usually unitary, meaning you can only be one at a time, though this is slightly changing with high rates of intermarriage. It also tends to be hierarchical, meaning that racial categories bear social meaning that places them on a scale from low power to high power. Similarly, ethnicity is defined as a collectivity within larger society, a group, having common ancestry that can be real or believed, and memories of a shared historical past, and a cultural focus on one or more symbolic elements. In this way, ethnicity is more fluid than race and has a higher element of choice built into it. I recall a Pew Hispanic piece that answered the weighty question of, who is Hispanic? They shared many iterations of the question like, how do I know if I'm Hispanic? My mother is from Cuba. Am I Hispanic? I speak Spanish. Am I Hispanic? The answer to each of these questions was always the same, regardless of the iteration. You are if you say you are. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek response, but it highlights the idea that as an academic exercise, ethnicity is entirely based on self-identification. However, for Latinos, there is some question as to whether this distinction is appropriate any longer. Here is some survey data from Pew Research that suggests that the lines between race and ethnicity for Latinos are becoming blurred. In total, 2/3 of survey adult Hispanic respondents said that being Hispanic is a part of their race and ethnicity. Researchers first discovered this phenomenon in 2000s when an increasing number of Latinos would mark the other category on surveys and official documents and write in Latino or Hispanic as their race. So, in a discussion of power, why am I bringing this up? Because recall that the main difference between race and ethnicity is the ability to self-identify, to be the tiny kitty in my 3-year-old's terminology. So when the Latino population begins to feel that their identity is being assigned to them based on their phenotype or physical appearance, and built into that ascription process is a social construction of identity based on negative stereotypes, you take a vital power away from the Latino community. You might say, okay, Professor Sanchez, but we're here today to talk about the power of Latinas, woman power. Why is this important? Well, it's important because when asked, Latino women espouse stronger feelings of attachment to their Hispanic identity than Latino men. And they're more likely to say that their identity as Latinas is impactful on how they view themselves when compared to their male Latino counterparts. Interestingly, Latino men are more likely than Latino women to rank American as a top aspect of their identity. That is to say that Latina female identity is not the same as Latino male identity. I have only to look at my own family to see aspects of these differences. I recall asking my maternal grandpa once about his identity, and he responded quite emphatically. He said, "Mijita, I'm an American." Certainly there were some generational aspects to this answer, he having fought in World War II, but still, he was unwilling to call himself Hispanic, over and above his American identity. Latina women feel the opposite. Their identity is closely based on their ethnic roots. What does the Latina identity entail? Or put another way, what makes it different from the Latino male identity? Scholars in sociology and political science have long discussed the gender roles that are unique to the Latino identity. They were referred to as Marianismo and Machismo. The traditional role of the Latina woman is based in the Roman Catholic faith and the veneration of the Virgin Mary. Latina women often try to emulate the Virgin in their role in the family. Marianismo characterizes women as the selfless moral and spiritual center of the family. By way of example, in my own family, my mom is seen as the fairest in all cases requiring arbitration. In particular, this role is most frequently exercised when it comes to the division of any sort of dessert like cake or empanadas or cookies, etc. But to use a more serious example, often when we see this type of matriarchal behavior with regard to religion is when Latinos are older female families like grandmothers, aunts, will ensure that their new babies are baptized if the parents appear to be reticent to do so. Here we see Latinas firmly ensconced in their role as spiritual and moral center and passing that on by generation. By contrast, machismo casts Latino men in the role of provider and protector, with a strong sense of duty and honor. Though they are often expected to be the economic head of household, this has been shifting during the last several decades. Latino women are increasingly sharing or taking over duties as the economic head of household. You'll notice the importance of family is implicit in each of these gender roles. There's a popular internet meme that begins with the hashtag, "You know you're Latino if." And one of the most popular is, "You know you are Latino if referring to your family doesn't just mean your parents and siblings." Researchers in the 90s provided evidence that familialism is higher among Latino families than non-Latino whites, and it emphasizes the need of the family over the needs of the individual. Indeed, Marianismo makes explicit the valuation of selflessness or sacrifice. I'll show you evidence in a moment that suggests that Latina power lives in these folkways. But for now, it's important to understand that the identity of a Latina woman is strongly tied to the identity of her family. Critics of this characterization of Latina women are quick to state that sacrifice is not feminist, or is simply another means of oppression. But as I'll show you, sacrifice or selflessness is a type of power, and it's willingly deployed because of this blurred line between personal identity and familial identity. It's a choice. Before we can evaluate Latina power explicitly, I think it's appropriate for us to get on the same page with the concept of power. As a culture, we throw around the term power a lot, but a concrete definition is somewhat hard to come by. There is certainly a burgeoning scholarship surrounding power and its use, as well as a myriad of typologies and definitions trying to pin down its boundaries. As I prepared for this lecture, I took a look at many different definitions, but none of them seemed to capture the American variant of individual-level political power in an adequate way. Moreover, in the United States, I think we're highly suspicious of the word power, especially as it applies to government. We see the thirst for power as bad. People with too much power are said to become power mad. Oftentimes, it's associated with superiority and supremacy, all dirty words in the American lexicon. When asked who is powerful in the United States, I think most of us would come up with something like this. We think of presidents, CEOs, congressmen. Essentially, we think of authority and legitimacy. Each of these men are granted authority through the legitimizing function of government office or wealth. I would argue to you that this is a traditional power. And by the way, note that all of these are men, and white men at that. Though authority and legitimacy aid in the exercise of power, we're still left with the task of defining power. What you see here is a culmination of many lines of political inquiry into power. However, figuring prominently among each definition was just one concept: influence. Essentially, the ability to influence the actions, ideologies, or behavior of others. I asked this question of my students a few weeks ago. Do Latinas have power? And this was to get them to critically evaluate Latinas in terms of our understanding of power. The simplicity of the question, I think, belies the complexity of the answer. If we look at traditional forms of power, such as those relating to authority and legitimacy, I think the answer is no. And before you jump on me, allow me to explain why. Here is some data from the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, known as NALEO. This data is kind of the gold standard for measuring the number of Latinos serving in government in the United States today, at every level, local, state, and federal. So what I've reproduced for you here comes from the most recent complete data set from 2018. As you can see, the number of Latinas serving in high-ranking electoral positions is dismal, and 2018 was a watershed year for Latinas in achieving political office. Only 20 Latinas have served in the U.S. Congress throughout its history. 2% of the U.S. House of Representatives are Latina. In 2018, there was one Latina governor, only the second in history. There's only been one Latina senator, one. She was first elected in 2016 and still serves today. A good piece of news is that Latinas are increasing their candidacy for the United States Congress, especially beginning in 2014. In the 2020 election, 75 candidates are Latina, a record. But this number includes many who already lost in their primary. So what remains to be seen is if candidacy materializes into offices in November. Today, 9% of the U.S. population are Hispanic women, but only 2% of the U.S. Congress. So here are some of our Latina leaders who have gained traditional political power. I show you these Latina leaders for several reasons. First, though I believe that Latinas have low levels of traditional power, we are gaining steam, and these women are the evidence. You see here the first Latina senator, Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the first Latina woman ever elected to Congress in 1989. Susana Martinez, the first Latina governor in the United States, was first elected in 2011 by the state of New Mexico. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest woman to serve in Congress. Linda Sanchez, the first woman of color to hold a leadership position in Congress. Regina Romero, the first Latina mayor of Tucson. and of course, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic member of the Supreme Court. The second reason I show you these photographs is to demonstrate that Latinas are the perennial firsts. What I mean by this is that power accruing to these women is so new as to always require the first moniker. This becomes more frustrating when you realize that Latinos have been a part of U.S. society since before there was a United States. My own family has been in the United States, in the state of New Mexico, since a land grant in the 1500s. That aptly passed through my paternal grandmother, Elsie Sanchez. The third reason I show you these pictures is to highlight emerging research that suggests that Latinas make really good candidates when they're willing to throw their hat into the ring, which is research suggests from COP that multiple taps are required to achieve this. But when they do run, they are successful, what we would call quality candidates, engendering what's being identified as the Latina advantage. A colleague I respect actually joked that she was very excited to read Sonia Sotomayor's biography. But when she did, she couldn't get through it because she said it was too boring. She laughingly told me, "I couldn't get through it. She did everything right." But this is the nature of being a Latina wielding traditional power. You must be beyond reproach at all times. Do better. Be more prepared. Better dressed. Speak more effectively. Do it all. Contact theory suggests that this is a vital way around racial threat from minority groups. Being beyond reproach means that minorities themselves must ensure positive contact experiences with majority groups. But it leaves many Latinas open to imposter syndrome and microaggressions in the white and male-dominated spaces they occupy. Public health specialists find that these stressors lead to poorer health outcomes. One of the most well-documented examples of this relationship is among Black women. The more educated they are, the more unhealthy they are. And this is not as a result of personal choices, but as a result of accumulated stress, what is referred to by psychologists as allostatic load. What's more is neurobiologists are finding that this stress might actually impact future generations through epigenetic changes to the DNA of minority populations. In other words, pressure to be models for their community literally imprints stress into the DNA of minority women, who then pass these genetic changes onto their children. Unfortunately, it doesn't get much better when we look at the social and economic demographics of Latinas in the masses. Here you can see the distribution of women-owned business by race and ethnicity. What you should take away from this graph is that Latinas and Black women are highly likely to open their own businesses, represented by the orange line. For their part, Latina-owned businesses account for 18% of all women-owned businesses in 2018. However, Latina and Black women see very low revenue from the process, revenue not commensurate with their activity in the small business world. For white women and Asian women business owners, the revenue and business ownership achieve greater parity. The Latino revenue gap for small business owners was $167.9 thousand in 2018. I will note that throughout history, there have only been 2 Latina CEOs of Fortune 500 businesses, the first in 2009. All of these firsts are remarkable because they're within my own lifetime and my adult cognition, and likely in many of yours. Latinas have a long history of entrepreneurship in the United States. One famous example is the San Antonio Chili Queens, who sold chili con carne in Military Plaza in San Antonio. There are also the Tamaleras in New Mexico and California, so they're no strangers to business. Aside from business ownership, Latina occupational status is also really low. This data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that Latinas have higher representation than other women in service occupations, sales, and production occupations. They are least likely to have professional occupations or be represented in management and financial operations. Drilling down further to income and wages, Latinas have the highest wage gap of any female racial or ethnic group. The stark number that you see here represents the national Latina wage gap. Hispanic women make 54 cents for every dollar made by a white man in the United States. 54 cents. Their dual minority status, or what we'd call intersectionality as women and ethnic minorities, results in a 46-cent reduction in wages by dollar. Because the economic power afforded to Latinos are so drastically different, I show you the data a second way. The median income for Latinas in 2019 was $33,540. For white males, the median income was nearly double at $61,576. That's an income loss of $28,036 in the year of 2019. Latinas had to work 11 months into 2019 just to make the same pay as whites made in the full year of 2018. The Latino wage gap well demonstrates issues of discrimination, dubbed by researchers the Hispanic woman's penalty and the white man's premium. Here you see data from the Institute for Women's Policy Research that provides evidence that Latina gap isn't purely due to difference in occupation or profession. As you can see, Latinos receive lower pay in the same professions, a 65% gap in law and legal professions as compared to white men's median annual salary, a 39% gap in managerial positions, an 18% gap in nursing, a 16% gap in teaching, and a 51% gap in sales profession. I know what you're thinking. Latinos are not being paid as much because they have lower qualifications, like education. Not so. Here's the same wage gap put in terms of educational attainment. This graph certainly hits home for me. I always joke and tell my family that I gave my 20s to college and that my first child was a PhD. So this really hurts. You can see that the pay gap actually widens as educational attainment increases for Latina women like myself. For Latinas with advanced degrees, there's a 37% pay gap in average weekly earnings. That's a difference of $678 each week. Over 52 weeks, that's a loss of $35,256. So to put this in terms of opportunity costs, that's more than 4 years of tuition at an average public university. It's a 2020 Mustang GT, or a sizable down payment on a house. Perhaps more troubling is that in the United States, we're extremely likely to interpret pay as a metric of self-worth. So here, society is sending Latinas a clear message that if money is equivalent to worth, they have less value. I also think the wage gap demonstrates issues of structural racism in the United States. Structural racism, though complex, can be thought of as differential life chances for minority individuals and then the societal mechanism that supports these differences. Here you see the Latino wage gap juxtaposed with the 10 most likely occupations for Hispanic women. Same story. In low occupational status jobs, less pay. Some of this occupational distribution could be attributed to the median age of Latinas. They are 12 years younger than their female, non-Hispanic white counterparts, and therefore may not have achieved, on average, their career goals. They're the youngest of any racial or ethnic minority group. And a few more facts I'll throw at you. Latinas are least likely among their female counterparts to be employed full-time, more likely to be unemployed, and more likely to be full-time homemakers. By now, I have built up a case that by traditional metrics of power, such as political office, economic success, occupation and income, Latinas are underpowered. But how about in terms of mass political power? In the United States today, Latinas make up 16.4% of the female population and are expected to rise to 26% of the female population by 2015. They are currently 9% of the overall U.S. population. On first blush, this sounds like a small group, but allow me to put it in perspective. Research suggests that in 2016, the presidential election was decided by roughly 80,000 votes cast in just 3 states. Latinas are 28 million, so a change in their political participation or political behavior could be instrumental in elections. So let's take a look at their political behavior. First and foremost, it's important to note that Latinas have political behaviors that are unique from those belonging to other races and ethnicities. But I think what is most interesting is that Latinos have different political behaviors from Latino men as well. But the treatment of Latinos as substantively different from Latino men is fairly rare in political science. Here you can see that your average Latina is a Democrat, with 51% Democrats, 14% Republicans, 20% are independents, and 8% say other. What's interesting is that Latinas are more likely than the general public to identify with one of the two major parties. Latinos are also less likely than Latino males to be Republican at 13% to 20% respectively. They are also more likely to be Democrats than Latino men at 51% to 42%. In terms of political participation or civic power, Latinas are much less likely to engage in politics than their male counterparts. Latinas are less likely to be registered to vote, though they are just as likely to vote as Latinos if they are registered. They are less likely to recognize voting as an important political activity. They're less likely to be mobilized by a political campaign, less likely to run for office or even consider it, less likely to participate in social, cultural, civic, or political meetings, less likely to discuss politics with family and friends, less likely to discuss politics in social media, less likely to contribute to candidates, work for candidates, wear or post political signage, contact representatives, work with others to solve a societal problem, or attend a meeting to discuss issues that face the community. And I think it's really important here that 30% of Latinas say they aren't interested in politics because it's too complex. This is problematic. With regard to issues, Latinos are highly concerned about healthcare, less optimistic about the economy than Latinos, more worried about affordable housing and women's rights, including abortion practices, than Latino men. They also tend to hold some interesting views on immigration, another top issue for Latinos and Latinas alike. Though with the presence of COVID-19, this interest has ebbed slightly. Latino men and women are supportive of ID requirements for immigrants, and Latinas are more likely than Latinos to say that undocumented should be allowed to stay in their jobs in the US and apply for citizenship than male Latinos. I understand that the picture I paint of Latinas and their power is dismal. By traditional metrics, Latinas are held back. But this series is about woman power. So where does Latina power lie? Well, now let's get to that. This is her. This is my mom. You also see that I snuck my dad in here. She's the smartest, most generous woman I've ever known. She didn't go to college because she had me and my sisters. She could have had any occupation she wanted, but she chose us. This is what Latina mothers have been doing. They've been holding up their children, pushing forward their girls. I was involved in a panel recently that was available to the public for live streaming on the internet, and my husband excitedly sent my parents the information to watch it live. I later heard from my mom that as they sat side by side watching the event together on an iPad, my dad looked at my mom and said, "This is it. This is why we did what we did." And I had never felt more humbled. But what is so special about this is that Latina mothers are doing this everywhere. I frequently ask my classes for their wisdom on projects I'm working on, and this was no exception. I asked them what Latina power looked like to them. And to a man, each one relayed a story just like mine. Moms who chose them, who chose to pave the way for them to go to college, for them to realize their dreams. And it's not just my heart that tells me this. The data suggests this as well. Here you can see educational attainment data broken up by Latina mothers versus Latina daughters. As is readily apparent, in each case of higher education, Latina daughters nearly doubled the educational attainment of their mothers in one generation. How is this possible? Latina millennials are actually now delaying marriage and children until after they get their education. Between 2000 and 2017, Latina millennials experienced a 70% growth in college degrees for Latina millennials in just 2 decades. They also have record labor force participation and are increasing their engagement in the medical field in record numbers. I've heard recently that the future is female. Well, I'll add the future is Latina. We need to work to relieve social and economic discrimination of Latinos. The battle's not won yet. We need to reduce barriers to achievement. We need to celebrate women and Latinas and their unique voices in society. We need better education for the growing Latino K-12 population. We need to remove the wage gap, the educational attainment gap. Interestingly, the gap between Latinos and non-Latinos in educational attainment and achievement starts in 4th grade. 4th grade. Latinas need more access to resources like healthcare and greater visibility in media. This is my why. I choose them so one day they don't have to choose, so they can be the tiny kitty and never have to ask for permission. Thanks.